The night shift had its own kind of hush. It wasn't just the dimmed lights or the lull between rounds. It was the kind of quiet that settled in the bones. A quiet that echoed through the long hallways of St. Augustine's Hospital, where whispers carried farther than footsteps and time softened like warm wax. Nurse Livia Reyes had grown used to that quiet. She moved through it with the ease of someone who had made peace with solitude. 37, slender and composed, with a gentle face rarely seen without her hair pulled back into a loose bun, Livia had the kind of presence that made patients feel like breathing was easier. Her kindness was quiet too. It wasn't in grand declarations or loud cheerfulness. It was in the way she refilled water pitchers before anyone had to ask. In how she folded blankets at the corners. In how she remembered names even when families forgot them. She worked mostly on the third floor, neurology and long-term care. Her patient roster didn't shift often, and lately her rounds always ended in room 314. That room, bathed in soft gold from the bedside lamp, housed a man who hadn't spoken in nearly 3 months. His name was Thomas Hale, 42, no next of kin listed, admitted after a traumatic brain injury sustained in a car accident just outside of Milford. He'd been comatose for weeks, then slowly roused, opening his eyes but never speaking, never acknowledging, never blinking in response. His expression was calm, his body responsive to physical therapy, but his voice had vanished. Doctors charted progress, tried various therapies, but his silence stayed like a curtain drawn tight. Other nurses rotated out, some called him the ghost. Others avoided his room entirely during quiet hours, but Livia never skipped him. Something about the way he looked, like someone halfway between here and a memory, kept her returning. She began singing to him the second week he opened his eyes. It started with humming, unconscious at first. A melody under her breath as she checked vitals or adjusted his IV, old lullabies, half-forgotten folk songs from her childhood, nothing polished but warm, raw, full of heart. Then one night she pulled the chair closer to his bed and quietly sang a whole song. I wandered today to the hill, Maggie. She didn't know why she picked that one. Maybe it was something in the way the night looked from his window. Maybe it was the ache in her own chest that she hadn't touched in years. She finished the verse and looked over at him. His eyes were open, still and watching, though she couldn't tell if he truly saw her. From that night on, it became a ritual. Every shift after charts and rounds and medications were complete, she sat beside him and sang, sometimes just one song, sometimes two. Occasionally she whispered between verses, little things, bits about her day. The nurse manager's latest obsession with lavender oil, the cafeteria's terrible soup, a patient on the second floor who smuggled in her cat. He never responded. But something about his presence grounded her in a way she didn't fully understand. Outside that room, Livia's life was unremarkable. She lived in a small rented apartment above a bakery that opened at 4 every morning. The scent of bread rising often woke her, even on her days off. Her plants leaned always toward the window. She had a few friends, mostly fellow nurses, and an older neighbor named Mr. Valenti who brought her coffee in winter just to check on her. There were no voicemails waiting when she came home, no missed calls she yearned to return. She had loved once long ago. It had ended quietly without explosion, just two people who stopped finding their way back to each other. Grief had been part of her long before she wore scrubs. Her mother passed away when Livia was 16, her father a few years later. Since then, she had become someone who watched the world gently, not one who rushed into it. Thomas, in his silent state, reminded her of something familiar. Not quite grief, not quite waiting, more like the hush of a held breath. One night the storm outside shook the windows so hard it made the fluorescent lights flicker. A tree limb slapped against the hospital's outer wall. The power flickered twice before the generators kicked in. Livia made her rounds with quiet steadiness, calming a few patients woken by thunder. When she entered room 314, Thomas was lying the same way he always did, his head slightly tilted toward the window, his expression as still as breath before sleep. She sat down and rubbed her hands together for warmth. Hey there, she whispered. We've got ourselves a storm. I hope you're not afraid of thunder. She smiled faintly, though no response came. She leaned in, brushing a strand of hair from her cheek. All right, tonight's something a little sad, but I promise I'll follow it up with something light. Her voice was quiet, husky from the chill. She sang an old Appalachian ballad about two lovers separated by a mountain. Her voice filled the room like soft candlelight. As she finished, thunder rumbled again, distant now. She stood, smoothing her hand across the blanket by his side. Good night, Thomas, she said softly. Just as she turned to go, a faint movement stopped her. A flicker, not a twitch, not a reflex, his lips parted just enough, his throat a tremor. She froze. His eyes were open, still distant, but something about them had changed. Less fog, more shadow, a flicker of presence. She stepped closer, her heart suddenly loud in her ears. Thomas, she whispered, did you? But it passed like wind through leaves, gone before she could reach it. She said nothing, not to the attending physician the next morning, not to her coworkers. She told herself it had been the storm, a trick of the light, but her hands trembled slightly as she poured her coffee in the break room. The next night she came back with a book of songs. And her voice, though still quiet, carried just a little stronger through the halls. It was 2 weeks before he moved again. During that time, Livia kept singing. Her voice threaded through room 314 each night with the care of someone mending something delicate. She brought in songs she hadn't thought about in years. Old Spanish boleros her mother used to play on Sunday afternoons, jazz standards from her college roommate's record player, soft country hymns she'd learned from a patient once back when she worked hospice. Some nights she saw the same flicker at the corner of his lips, a tension in his jaw like a note caught in the throat, but nothing that could be charted or proven. Still, she began singing slower, holding her final notes longer, leaving space as if waiting for something to meet her in return. Outside his room, the hospital shifted in its usual patterns. Flu season crept in. A child was born on the first floor while a palliative patient passed quietly on the fourth. There was a fire drill that interrupted lunch and a donor wall that got repainted. Livia moved through it all with her usual quiet steadiness, always ending her shift with him. Then one night just past 1 in the morning, Thomas blinked. It wasn't the absent, automatic blink she'd grown used to. It was full and deliberate, timed to her name. She had been kneeling beside his bed, adjusting the pressure cuff on his arm when she spoke gently to him. You know, the lavender in the courtyard's finally blooming. You'd like it there, I think. Quiet, smells like summer trying to sneak in early. And then she said, softer, almost unconsciously, Thomas, I hope you're still in there. And he blinked once, steady like yes. Her breath caught. She backed away just a bit and stood up straight, not daring to look away. Can you do that again? She asked, voice low but urgent. If you understand me, can you blink once more? He didn't. But his eyes followed her this time when she moved to the window. A small, careful tracking, enough that she pressed her hand to her chest. That morning she reported it to the neurologist on duty, a young man named Dr. Pirelli who wore fatigue under his eyes like shadow. He came to check on Thomas but shook his head after a few tests. Could be reflex, he said with a shrug. Don't get your hopes too far up. But her hope had already begun to take root, small and stubborn. She didn't tell anyone else, not yet. Instead, she started bringing in small things from outside the hospital, a newspaper with the crossword half done for him to see, a radio she played softly while she worked, tuned to a classical station, and once a cutting from the courtyard's lavender bush placed in a jar on the sill. One night she decided not to sing. She sat quietly by his side, letting the silence stretch between them. I don't know what your voice sounds like, she said after a while, but I think it might be deep, not loud, just full. She leaned back in her chair, her gaze on the ceiling. When I was a kid, I used to think everyone I met had a song inside them, a real one, like a little melody only they could hum if they ever got truly safe. That's probably a strange thing to say to someone who hasn't spoken in months. Thomas blinked again. This time she didn't ask for it, it wasn't prompted. It came after her words like a period at the end of a sentence. She sat up straighter. You're still in there, aren't you? He blinked again. From that night on, their silence changed shape. It became a conversation. She started reading to him, passages from books she found at the local thrift store, excerpts from travel magazines she picked up at the gas station. Sometimes she simply talked about the way the light moved on the linoleum during dusk, about her landlord's habit of whistling through the vents, about the quiet ache that lived in her chest when the sun set too quickly. She didn't expect answers, but she began to notice his responses, subtle, delicate cues, a shift in his gaze, a tension in his fingers, a softening around his mouth. He was listening. Late one Thursday, while the floor was unusually quiet and the only sound came from the ventilator of a patient 2 doors down, she asked him a question. Was there someone you used to sing with, she whispered, a sister, a mother, a love? His expression didn't change. But as she began to sing again, I'll be seeing you in all the old familiar places, his lips moved, just slightly, enough that she nearly stopped mid-note. She leaned in, his eyes flicked to hers, and for the first time she saw emotion there. Not clarity, not full recognition, but something softer, like warmth returned to frozen water. You're trying, aren't you? She murmured. That night she didn't sleep when she got home. Instead, she sat on her balcony with a blanket around her shoulders and tried to imagine his voice. She thought of what it would feel like to hear it, cracked from disuse maybe, but still real, still his. At the hospital, changes began to take place. A new speech therapist was assigned to his case after Livia quietly pushed for it. A gentle woman named Corrine who approached Thomas like someone coaxing a wild bird from hiding. They began slow, mirrors, breathing techniques, hand-over-hand prompts. Livia watched from the doorway some afternoons, her chest tight with something like wonder. Spring crept in quietly. The cherry tree outside the west wing bloomed in pink flutters, and sunlight began slipping through the windows earlier in the day. Livia found herself lingering in Thomas's room longer each night, sometimes until her relief nurse gently nudged her out. Then on a Thursday in May, something extraordinary happened. She had just finished singing "The Water is Wide," her voice barely more than a whisper by the final verse. When she finished, the quiet stretched between them as always. She reached for her bag, ready to say goodnight when she heard a sound. Soft, barely formed, a note, not a word. Her eyes flew to him, his lips were parted, his chest trembled from the effort. And then he did it again. A single note, hoarse, unsteady, but unmistakable. She dropped her bag, moved to his side, hands shaking. "Thomas," she whispered, was that you?" His throat moved, then, broken but clear, came something that made her eyes fill instantly. He hummed the last line she'd sung, just that. No lyrics, just music, echoed back like a ribbon passed between them. She pressed her hand to her mouth, tears sliding down her cheeks. "You sang back," she whispered, voice breaking. "You sang back." She didn't call the doctor right away. She sat down instead. And she sang the song again, softer this time, her voice trembling with something she hadn't felt in years. "Hope." A few doors down, a monitor beeped. A nurse wheeled a cart into the linen closet. But in room 314, a quiet miracle bloomed between two people, stitched from silence, song, and the belief that even the stillest hearts can find their voice again. Word of Thomas singing reached the morning staff before the sun was even up. Nurse Petra from the incoming shift had arrived early to relieve Livia and found her sitting in the chair beside Thomas, eyes rimmed red but shining, her hand resting lightly on his. "He made a sound," Livia said quietly, barely louder than breath. He sang. The next 48 hours unfolded in a flurry of cautious celebration. Dr. Pirelli returned, eyebrows raised skeptically, but after several quiet minutes with Thomas, he emerged from the room looking as if someone had just handed him a riddle he'd long given up solving. "There's definitely vocalization," he confirmed, clipboard in hand. "Could be the start of expressive speech returning. We'll adjust his therapy plan." But Livia already knew it wasn't just a clinical step forward. It wasn't a muscle twitch or random exhale. It had been melody, strained and fragile, yes, but true in its core. He had remembered her song and given it back to her. Thomas remained unable to speak, but in the days that followed, his efforts to hum, however broken, became more frequent. Corrine began spending longer hours at his bedside, guiding him through warm-up exercises, encouraging pitch control. Sometimes it ended in coughs or silence, but sometimes Thomas made sound, not often words, but tones that curled like vines toward something fuller. The staff started calling them his songs. And Livia, she listened like someone guarding a sacred thing. Their evenings changed. She began bringing a small keyboard she borrowed from the PEDS unit, nothing elaborate, just enough keys to carry a tune. She wasn't a pianist, but she played chords softly, matching the lullabies she sang. She let the music guide the rhythm of the night, and Thomas, though slow, responded. One night she played the opening notes of Shenandoah, and a low hum caught in his throat like smoke winding its way out of a long-sealed chimney. She smiled, eyes glinting with quiet joy. "You know that one, don't you?" she asked. He blinked. The conversations were still mostly one-sided, but his gaze held hers longer now. He followed her when she moved around the room, and occasionally, rarely, his lips would form silent words, a phantom of speech. She began to read his eyes like tides. "You're trying to say something," she whispered one night, her palm resting near his hand. He shifted just enough that his fingers brushed hers. It was the first time he'd reached back. That touch, soft, tentative, shook something loose in her. Later, in the staff bathroom, she leaned against the tiled wall and let herself cry, not because of grief, but because the silence that had lived inside her for so long, one she had come to accept as permanent, was starting to unravel. Not just his. Hers. She began telling him things she hadn't spoken aloud in years, about her father's laugh and the way her mother sang when she cooked, about the time she almost married someone but couldn't bring herself to say yes, about the years she'd spent convincing herself that solitude was simpler, safer. You make me feel like I didn't miss my chance, she said quietly one night as she smoothed the blanket over his chest, like something still waiting. She didn't expect him to understand, but when she stood to leave, he hummed again, just one note, and it felt like an answer. What? By June, Thomas had begun forming true words, whispered slow, pulled from some deep place inside him. His first full sentence came during a therapy session while Livia stood just outside the doorway. Corrine asked him, as she did each day, "Can you tell me something you remember?" His voice was rasped, nearly inaudible. But he said, "She sings." Corrine turned, stunned. Livia stepped into the room, frozen in place. "She sings," he repeated slightly louder, his eyes fixed on Livia like the words themselves were stitched to her presence. Corrine glanced at Livia, eyes shining. "I think he means you." Livia's hand rose to her chest, her breath shallow. She nodded, "Yes, I do." From that day on, something shifted. His voice grew stronger, not fluent, not easy, but determined. He began to speak in full phrases, halting, hesitant, but clear. His memory remained fractured, stitched together in patches. Names eluded him, places blurred, but when Livia was near, the fog lifted more quickly. "She's my nurse," he said one afternoon to Dr. Pirelli. "Yes," the doctor nodded, "Nurse Ray's." Thomas looked at her then, something warm in his eyes. "She's more." Livia turned away quickly, cheeks flushed. She didn't know what it meant, if it was the haziness of recovery speaking or something rooted deeper. But the word lingered in her chest like light underwater. What? Outside the hospital, summer settled in thick and full. The courtyard bloomed wildly, the lavender and sage climbing over the edges of their planters. Livia began wheeling Thomas out there in the early evenings, after the rush of the day quieted. The first time they did, he closed his eyes and breathed deeply. "Smells like sun," he murmured. They sat there for nearly an hour without speaking, watching shadows move across the stone path. "Were you a singer?" she asked eventually. He blinked slowly, "Guitar." She smiled, "Acoustic." He nodded. "Folk," she guessed. A pause, "Yes, and blues." She laughed, "I knew it." She began bringing her father's old guitar to work, the one she'd kept tucked in a closet for years, too sentimental to sell, too painful to play. Her fingers were rusty, but the music came back in pieces, just like Thomas's voice. She played, and he sang in low, rough tones, barely formed but rich with effort. They were rebuilding something together, one chord, one note, one evening at a time. They became known on the floor as the Night Shift Duet. But Livia didn't care about nicknames. What mattered were the quiet moments, when she played a song he hadn't heard in years and saw recognition bloom in his expression, or when he managed to say, "I missed this," and she understood he meant more than music. He meant connection. And for the first time in a long time, so did she. Still, not everything was simple. There were setbacks. Some days Thomas couldn't speak at all. Other times his memory regressed, leaving him confused, frustrated, silent. Livia stayed through those moments, not with solutions, but with presence. She didn't try to fix what faltered, she just stayed. That, more than anything, became his anchor. Late one July evening, during a light rain, they sat again in the courtyard. The scent of damp soil and lavender hung in the air. Livia strummed softly, playing a melody with no lyrics. Thomas turned his head slowly. "Why do you sing to me?" he asked, voice low. She looked up, surprised. "I don't know," she answered honestly. "At first, I just needed to believe someone was still listening, that it mattered." "And now?" She met his eyes, her own soft with feeling. "Now I sing because you're here, and I think maybe I am too." He reached for her hand, his grip was still weak, but the warmth in it steadied her. And when she sang that night, it wasn't just a lullaby. It was a promise. The hospital began to feel like something softer than it had before. Not because the walls had changed or the machines had stopped beeping, but because something between room 314 and the heart of the third floor had shifted. The nurses said it was because Thomas was singing now, but Livia knew it went deeper than that. It wasn't just his voice that had returned, it was his will, his presence, and perhaps hers too. August came heavy with heat. On her days off, Livia walked by the river in the early mornings when the world still felt quiet. She'd found herself humming as she walked, almost without thinking, little fragments of songs, notes that reminded her of him. She saw him every shift now, even when he wasn't assigned to her. His care plan had shifted toward more intensive rehabilitation. He had physical therapy, occupational therapy, and speech all bundled into his days, but he always asked if Livia would come by in the evening, and she did, not just because he asked, but because it had become a rhythm she didn't want to live without. One evening, she arrived just as the sunset turned the corridor gold. Thomas was sitting up straighter than she'd ever seen him, a soft cardigan draped over his shoulders, eyes already searching for her when she walked in. "I saved a song," he said, slow but clear. "Oh," she smiled, settling beside him. "Which one?" He looked at her, then at the small notebook on his lap, one Corrine had given him for writing down lyrics and exercises. "I wrote ones." Livia stilled. "You wrote a song." He nodded, the corners of his mouth curling into something like shy pride. He opened the notebook with trembling hands and held it out to her. The lyrics were simple, unpolished, the handwriting still jagged from muscle strain, but the words quiet, heartfelt lines about waiting in the dark, about the sound of a voice that brought him back, they unraveled something deep in her. "I want you to sing it," he said. Her throat tightened. "I'd be honored," she whispered. She looked at the chords he had scribbled in the margins. They weren't complicated, a G major here, an E minor there, but they were his choices, his story. She played the opening slowly on the guitar, adjusting her fingers as she listened for his breath. And then she sang. It wasn't perfect, her voice caught on a few words, the notes trembled. But the way he looked at her, eyes full, unwavering, it felt like standing in sunlight after years of overcast skies. When she finished, neither of them spoke. Instead, he reached for her hand and held it with a quiet certainty that made her feel like the world had just stilled. By September, Thomas had transitioned to outpatient therapy. He was discharged with little fanfare, but Livia was there that morning, helping him into a button-up shirt he hadn't worn since before the accident. He moved carefully, slower than he liked, but steadier now. His voice was still soft, uneven in places, but it came more easily with each passing week. "You'll keep singing?" he asked her as they waited for the transportation van. She looked at him, her heart full of 1,000 unsaid things. "If you'll keep listening." He smiled, always. She stood beside the van until it pulled away, her hand raised in a wave, the ache in her chest both warm and sharp. She had seen so many patients come and go over the years. Some had left her with grief, others with pride, but Thomas, he had left something else entirely. A piece of herself she didn't realize she had given, or maybe returned. They kept in touch. It started with brief messages, a voicemail here, a photo of a guitar pick he'd found wedged inside an old songbook. She didn't see him every day anymore, but somehow he felt even more present than before, like a thread that ran quietly beneath everything. And then one Saturday, a letter arrived. It was handwritten, folded neatly in thirds. No return address, just his name at the bottom in the same careful print he'd used in the lyric notebook. "Dear Livia, I sang again today, not just for practice. I sang because it felt right, because the room was quiet and I missed the sound of someone caring out loud. I keep hearing your voice in my head, not in a haunting way, but in a home kind of way. I think that's what you gave me. A voice, yes, but also a way back to belonging. Thank you. And if you ever want to sing together again, really sing outside of hospital walls, I'll be here." With warmth, Thomas, Livia pressed the letter to her chest. And that evening she brought out her guitar, tuned it carefully, and began writing a song of her own. October brought cooler winds and early dusks. One evening she received a call. It was Thomas. "Hi," he said, breathy but stronger than before. "I have a favor." She leaned against her kitchen counter, her pulse quickening. "Anything." "There's a coffee shop, just a small place down on Sycamore. They do open mic on Thursdays." She smiled. "Do you want to go listen?" A pause, then "No, I want to sing with you." She didn't answer right away, her throat was tight again. "Livia, I'd love that." The coffee shop was small, with mismatched chairs and a string of warm lights across the back wall. That Thursday night, they sat near the window, her guitar resting on her knee, his hand steadying a thermos of tea. When their names were called, the room hushed. Livia took a breath. And as they began to sing, his voice quiet but clear, hers wrapped around his in harmony, the space between them disappeared. People listened, some closed their eyes, others smiled quietly. But for Livia and Thomas, it wasn't about the audience. It was about a nurse who sang to a silent patient night after night. And the moment he sang back. Their voices carried softly across the room, tethered by months of waiting, of trying, of holding on when neither of them had any reason to believe something would come of it. But something had. Not just healing. Not just music. But love shaped slowly, patiently, in the quiet hours between midnight and morning. The seasons turned as they always did. Autumn folded into winter with breathy winds and early shadows, and the city wrapped itself in layers of flannel and fog. The hospital windows collected condensation in the mornings, and Livia found herself pressing her fingers to the glass, tracing absent shapes while waiting for the coffee to finish brewing. She still worked the night shift, still walked those same halls under the low hum of fluorescent light, still moved from room to room with her quiet steadiness. But something had changed. Not in loud, obvious ways. No grand confessions, no declarations scrawled across the sky, just small things. Her humming now reached corners of the ward it never had before. Her eyes crinkled more easily when she smiled, and when she sat in the break room, her thumb often circled a worn guitar pick she now kept in her pocket. Thomas was no longer her patient, but somehow he was still her heartbeat. They had kept singing. Thursday nights at the coffee shop became theirs. Sometimes they performed, sometimes they just sat near the back, sharing whispers and watching others bare their hearts through song. He'd grown stronger, his posture more upright, his voice richer, steadier, warmed by weeks of practice and patient progress. His memory was still a patchwork quilt, but the gaps mattered less now. What he built in the present was more than enough. And Livia, she had begun to write. Not just songs, but memories, fragments of days with her mother's voice in the kitchen, the feel of her father's jacket on cold mornings, her first years as a nurse. The first time she noticed Thomas's eyes following hers in that quiet room, she filled pages, not for anyone else, just for herself, as if finally, after years of caring for others, she had made space to tend to her own story. One snowy night in December, he invited her to his apartment. It was modest, lived in, with shelves of old books and a small table near the window where the light pooled like tea. A guitar leaned in the corner. A worn blue scarf hung on the back of a chair. She noticed that he still kept the lavender cutting she had once brought him, now pressed flat in a small frame. He handed her a mug of tea, their fingers brushing briefly. They sat on the floor, the heat from the radiator warming their backs. "I've been thinking," he said, turning his mug slowly in his hands, "about the first time you sang to me." She smiled gently. "You probably don't remember much of it." "I do," he said, surprising her. "Not all the words, but the feeling. It was like being held. Even when I couldn't move, it anchored me." She said nothing at first, just reached across the space between them and placed her hand lightly over his. "I wasn't trying to save you," she whispered. "I think I was trying to save something in myself." His eyes met hers steady. "Maybe we saved each other." He leaned in then slowly, his forehead brushing hers. No rush, no urgency, just warmth. She closed her eyes, the quiet of the room settling around them like a hush before snowfall. They didn't kiss, not yet. But something passed between them, soft as breath, strong as vow. The new year arrived quietly. No fireworks, no loud celebrations, just a sunrise over frost-glazed roofs and the sound of her boots crunching over snow as she walked the path from her apartment to the cafe. Thomas was already inside when she arrived, sitting near the window with 2 cups waiting. That night she sang the song he had written. He watched her as she played, and she watched him as he joined in on the second verse. His voice was still rough around the edges, but it fit hers in a way that felt inevitable. When they finished, the cafe clapped softly, a few smiles exchanged in the hush between songs. Thomas turned to her, eyes shining. "I remember something else," he said later as they walked home beneath a sky heavy with stars, from before the accident. She looked up at him, snowflakes catching in her lashes. "I was driving that night because I was leaving someone who told me I didn't know how to stay." She waited. "And I didn't, not back then. I kept running, but when I woke up and you were there every night singing, I finally stopped." Livia reached for his hand, held it tightly. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. They stopped beneath a street lamp, its glow casting soft halos around them. He pulled her closer, his hand cupping her cheek, his thumb brushing gently across her skin. And this time when they kissed, it was quiet and certain, like a song that had waited too long to be sung. Spring came back in time, as it always did. The lavender bloomed again in the courtyard, and on one golden evening, long after visiting hours, 2 people sat beneath it, her head on his shoulder, his hand curled around hers. They didn't speak much. They didn't need to. Because once a nurse had sung to a man who could not answer. And one day he sang back. And in the space between those songs, they found something neither of them had known they were looking for. Home.